Hello, world, and welcome to another episode of the Crisis Victory Show. Today, I'm going to have my executive producer and co-host, Pete Turner, who is also the founder of the Break It Down Show, going to be interviewing me with regard to some historical information we would like to share with our audience, going back to the creation of the Emerald Triangle in Northern California, the influence from Mexico that it had a play on the markets of Mexico during that time, and after the decline of the Emerald Triangle, how by the time Rafael Caracantero had created a superior marijuana in Mexico, how it has come back into recent fruition. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my co-host, Pete, and let him start the show. Hi, Pete.
Hey, Hal. Always great to chat with you. So, like you said, we're going to talk about the Emerald Triangle. There's a lot of information out there about it, but it's rarely told from your point of view when you've worked on both sides of the problem, and also you did the whole thing. So I guess to me, the beginning would be somewhere in the Vietnam era and coming back.
Yes.
You've got a bunch of dudes that have PTSD, which we know about. You got a bunch of dudes with combat skills, a bunch of dudes that aren't afraid to be, I would say, extra legal. Maybe illegal is a better term in some cases, but what was the environment like to get all of this going and make the Emerald Triangle what it was?
Well, thank you, Pete. That's a great place to start this interview. I would say I went through the VA hospital, came back stateside in the end of March of 74. And at that time, a lot of veterans were still coming out of Vietnam. They were being transferred over to the VA hospital there in Benicia, California, where I was at. And but what they were doing was they were heading north. Now we're talking 1974, 1975, 1976 era. And what they were doing was they were taking their skills that they had learned during combat in the war and becoming involved with the marijuana growers in what is known today as the Emerald Triangle. This would be Trinity County, Humboldt County, and Mendicino County, Northern California. And what they would do is they would go up there because of pot farm raiders, and they would get recruited by the growers to set up their perimeter defense lines, ambush sites, setting up booby traps on the trails. It became extremely violent, very dangerous era in time. Even the Department of Forestry would be posting regular warnings about people who would want to go out and hike certain trails. They would close the trails down because of the massive amount of marijuana that was being grown during that time. But taking it from that point, I'd like to step back a few years earlier when I was smuggling marijuana out of Mexico in the mid to late 70s to the early 80s myself. I remember the first kilos of marijuana I was bringing out. I could buy them down there in Zacatecas and Durango and Sinaloa for $20 a kilo. And the marijuana was just so bad. It was full of stems and seeds. And sometimes we'd even find crushed up birds or balls of yarn, stuff like that, hidden in the kilos when we break them down. And there was a guy named Rafael Caracantero. And Rafa, in collusion with a friend of his who was Angel Gallardo, Felix Gallardo, who later became the boss of all bosses in the later formed cartels in Mexico. They were experimenting in their village with marijuana at that time. And it was at that time that Rafael Caracantero created Sinsemilla, or seedless marijuana. And he knew that this would change the entire foundation of the marijuana industry. You see, Pete, during that time and in those years, the creation of the markets up in Northern California, they had created a superior marijuana. It was definitely making an impact on the marijuana trade institutions that were formulating grow operations down in Mexico during that time. And it was also an implemented time for them to introduce the cocaine markets into the United States because they were becoming so competitive with the Northern California markets. And I believe over 40% of the marijuana in the United States that was grown in the United States at that time came out of the Emerald Triangle. I was very involved. I knew a lot of people that were growers up there. I had an airplane. I lived in Ukiah, California during those years. So I would fly people above their patches anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 feet to where they could get an aerial observation of how their marijuana was camouflaged and blended into the hillsides and the mountainsides, because as you also know, this is about the time that DEA became involved. They were going up doing helicopter operations. They were harvesting the fields, putting them into bundles and pulling them by air underneath the helicopters to a town called Willits in Mendicino County, where they would drop these bundles of confiscated marijuana into the mill. Yeah, that's a great picture right there, Pete. That's exactly how they would harvest it. And I remember we would all kind of know when the marijuana was going to hit the mill where they burned it all. And the entire community turned out, and they would be downwind during the burning of the marijuana. I mean, it was published in TV and everything. It's pretty hilarious. But my God, they were getting hundreds of people high on that good bud. But anyway, getting back to the story of the creation of the Emerald Triangle. As you know, a very dear friend of mine, Greg Shipp, a man that I've known for over 50 years, was a founding father of the Emerald Triangle. And during a lapse in the marijuana business, I reconnected with Greg. We had my connection that was moving my marijuana that we were smuggling out of Mexico got taken down. I spent about a year being a poor student again and headed up to Ukiah to see my friends. And Greg and I had reconnected, and Greg was, they were growing literally thousands of plants up there in Humboldt County in northern Mendicino County at that time. So I had purchased a plane. I was getting my pilot's license and all that during that time. And Greg would introduce me to some of the growers, and he'd say, hey, they want to look at their plantations aerially so they can see which plants they need to pull because of aerial exposure, of course. Can show a symmetric or a certain pattern that is not geographically familiar with the other plant life in that area. So I'd take these growers up by air and we'd fly over their patches, and they would have somebody down below that they would be on radio walkie-talkie contact with, telling them, yeah, that segment there needs to be pulled, this segment there. And I did that for a couple of years, a couple harvest seasons. And that, Pete, is also how I got invited to the Dope Growers Convention, which was always right after harvest, an annual event up there where all of the top growers, very secretive, it wasn't exposed to the regular buyers of the public. So it was an honor to be invited to that big barn where they would hold that every year. And people would come in with mason jars of their top grade bud. And then what they would do is they would all grade the bud and make a unanimous decision as to who was the best grower during that year. And my fee to when I would fly them is I would just tell them I don't want money, I just want pot. So at the end of harvest season, the people that I had flown over their patches so they could make the changes they needed to make sure that DEA didn't take them out, they would just give me shopping bags full of bud marijuana, which of course ended up in Sacramento at that time. And I had friends that were able to offload all of it. But because of the creation of the Emerald Triangle and the impact that it had on the Mexican marijuana industry during those years where it was hitting its peak harvests and peak grow operations, it impacted the Mexican marijuana market so intensely at that time that it was also during the era 79, 80, 81, where cocaine was now being funneled through Mexico. And yeah, there's Raphael. I knew him. Good to see you, Raph. Anyway, the cocaine became the product of interest. And yes, they were still growing marijuana. Yes, they were still shipping marijuana stateside. They always will. It's always been a cultural thing. But I do believe the implementation of the Emerald Triangle was the causal effect of the cartel shifting, one of the effects of the cartel shifting into the cocaine trade. Yeah, that's a really good example of outdoor grows. And now you have to bear in mind, marijuana is basically legal. People can get permits and grow fields of it now, where, as you see a photo here of it being camouflaged, that's how it was back in the 70s and 80s before the legalization of marijuana for medical use. And also, another thing to look at is during that transition time, Pete, the illegal growers would go get permits to grow legal because it is now transitioned to where it's a medical phase before the recreational phase came into play. But the sheriff's departments up in those counties, they would go in there and they literally count the plants and pull everything over the permit numbers. And there was a lot of conflict going on at that time. I think there were a lot of pissed off cops because they had been fighting for years in the marijuana wars up there. And ladies and gentlemen, those of you that see this interview, I want to be very clear just exactly how dangerous this was for not only tourists that would walk the trails, but law enforcement also. You have former trained Vietnam veterans who would set up booby traps along the trails in Vietnam, and we're bringing back these experiences and these skills to protect the invasion, if you will, of people that would go in and try to steal from the patches or stumble across one and maybe tell law enforcement. I can assure you people did disappear up in those hills. So the Emerald Triangle was more effective than normal society even realizes based on the impact that it had in a foreign country and the impact that it had here in the markets of the United States. And I can remember buyers paying $4,000 a pound and more during those years because it would be heading back to the East Coast of the university communities where they were getting as much as $6,000 a pound for it. This is late 70s, early 80s. This was a time when the upgrading of the marijuana that was being manufactured and processed in Mexico was starting to come into effect. It was also the time. It was also during the time that DEA was heavily impacting the region of northern Mexico, northern California, and southern Oregon, trying their best to eradicate the main surplus grows that were going on up in those regions. So this is a really conflicting time for the marijuana industry that so many people would not have a knowledge of. And I remember full well when Greg, my friend Greg, who was one of the founding fathers of the Triangle, had to relocate himself over to Montana. It was getting so heated up with law enforcement there at that time. And these were also a few of the years that I was living in Ukiah, California, and working constantly with people that were having grow operations up there. So yeah, this is historical. I think the story needed to be shared with our community and the impact that it even has to this day. I understand that very recently in the Mexican Baja Peninsula, just a few months ago, they took down what is now considered the largest marijuana grow they ever took down. Then if you remember back in the 80s when Special Agent Kiki Camarena was able to come across the Chihuahua plantation that Rafael Caro Quintero is responsible for, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of hectares or acres of marijuana out in the middle of the desert out there where he had tapped into water sources and created the world's largest marijuana operation. This was discovered by a DEA agent, Kiki Camarena. I say his name with honor because of what he went through to try to do his job down there and all that he came up against as a result of doing his job. Because of that takedown and losing the world's largest marijuana plantation, yeah, that's a really good picture right there of it. And this is Chihuahua State. Everything outside of the green zone there is just burned desert. But Kiki Camarena was captured by he was captured by the Jalisco cartel, and he was executed as a result of his work. So rest in peace, Agent Camarena. Nothing but respect.
Yeah. Can we go back a little bit? Because you talked about the Vietnam connection. So
yes.
when these veterans come back and they're setting up booby traps, that kind of thing, what drove them into the weed business and why Mendicino in Trinity counties? Why that area?
Well, that's a really good question. A lot of them were coming back and they were still traumatized as a result of surviving the Vietnam War. And they didn't want to be around civilization, population. And I've talked to many of them, and they all had a similar story, Pete. They wanted to be up in those hills. They wanted to be away from people, but they were also still kind of connected, if you will, to the experiences of what Vietnam did to them. So they were able to use their skills to benefit other people that were trying to protect their marijuana grow operations up there that didn't have combative experience. And the Vietnam War played a significant role in the creation and the salvation during those years of the Emerald Triangle.
Yeah, I'm going to put a picture up. Or this is an actual thing from advice on if you come across a grow or signs to know if you're coming across a grow. And
Yes.
This is still to this day put out there. But even as a kid in the 80s, we would go out in these different areas, and we knew that, like, hey, be careful if you come across something, you need to get out of there. Don't go forward. If you're not sure, get out. That was kind of the standing advice. And so whether you were up in the Sierra or the foothills or north of where I was from in Benicia, that was a real thing for us to pay attention to.
Absolutely, Pete. There were a lot of casualties during the beginning years of the founding and creating of the Emerald Triangle itself. But I'm really glad that we can talk a little bit about the people that had survived the Vietnam War that became involved up there. I think that under today's standards, as you know, you and I are both PTSD patients. We both go to the VA for our treatment, and they didn't have that treatment during those years. And people would come back from the war and they would be so traumatized from what they survived over there that they couldn't fit into society. So this afforded an opportunity for them to self-adjust themselves, if you will, to come back into a society. I met Vietnam veterans up there that were laying booby traps that had been up there for a few years. And some of them were so messed up, Pete. I mean, that I don't think they would ever be able to come back to society. And I imagine even to this day, all these years later, there's some of them still in existence up there.
So there's an author named John Norris who used to be a fishing game. He was California fishing game, and then he was federal fishing game. And this doesn't seem like this makes sense, but he would be one of the guys in these extreme gunfights. And he talks about, I was in a gunfight in the hills above San Jose. He means San Jose, California. And when you're in that business, there is a lot of conflict. There are people flying in helicopters, there's people flying in airplanes, and they're doing things. And so there's crashes, and there's all these other things that happen with all this chaos. The state of California is looking at its, attorney general and saying, hey, John Van de Kamp, are you going too far? And he's having to talk to the press. Talk a little bit about that relationship, the cat and mouse, and the danger. I mean, I posted a thing from Tamales Tom. I'll put it up here in a second.
That's an interesting topic to our story today, Pete. Law enforcement had to almost literally become retrained. And this is where federal involvement came into play, because there were marshals and there were sheriffs and there were local constables that were in harm's way on a daily basis up there. But I remember back in, I think it was 81 or 82, I was living in Ukiah. Some friends asked me to drive a van up. They were going to go harvest some marijuana. It's about a month before the regular harvest season, so I was suspicious at the time. And I remember pulling to this camp just outside of Garberville, and they had another vehicle meet them, and they took off to go up in the hills. And what they were doing was raiding marijuana patches. And it was about 3 or so in the morning, and I remember all these red and blue flashing lights, and I'm sound asleep in the back of the van, and I hear a megaphone saying, police, get your hands up. We're coming into the van. Do not move, that kind of stuff. And I remember they slid the door open, they hauled me out and planted me on the ground. And I'm thinking, what the hell's going on here? And they said, well, your friend was just shot while raiding a marijuana patch. And he gave us your name and location. So you're under arrest and you're on your way up to Garberville, up to the jail. And I could play at that time that, well, I didn't know. I thought they were just coming up to get some of whatever it is that they were getting for themselves. I had no knowledge of this. And the friend, I'm not going to say his name on the show, but he was very nearly mortally wounded. He was shot through the liver. And the other one did get away that I took up there that night. But I remember while I was in custody, before they released me, the San Francisco newspaper called up there, and the cop came over and says, hey, do you want to be interviewed? They want to do an article on ambushes in the marijuana patches up here in the Emerald Triangle. And I refused to do the interview, but I believe it was in the San Francisco Times, and it would be called Pot Farm Raiders Caught in Ambush. That would be the title of the article. And I was there. I was involved in that, but inadvertently involved. I didn't go up there to rob a marijuana patch. I was taking some friends up there that had told me a story, how they had been ripped off by this guy. So they were going to go in and get their own from him in the middle of the night, ended up getting ambushed as a result. But, I knew of booby traps that were set up with shotgun shells that were put at head level. I remember traps that were laid on the ground where if you step through, you get bungee spikes through the foot, that kind of stuff. There was a lot of militarily introduced traps that were set throughout those regions. Very dangerous for law enforcement, extremely dangerous for untrained civilians. And I remember full well seeing the posted signs at trailheads up there about a month or so before harvest time that would say trails are strictly prohibited due to the marijuana conflicts they had going on up there. They were very open about it. And as you said earlier, Pete, this stuff was constantly in the news. I mean, it was really an amazing time in American history. And the Emerald Triangle ultimately started shifting to other regions of the United States. It became so heated up that some of the original fathers that were growing the marijuana, like my friend Greg, he went to Northern Oregon and started growing entire fields of it up there. But by then, they had already started introducing the medical marijuana thing. And so he would have permits. And I mean, it'd be funnier than hell. He'd be going down Interstate 5 between Eugene and Portland, and you could look over to one side of the road and just see fields and fields of marijuana. And I used to think, 10 years ago, they locked him up for it. Now they're giving him permits to grow it. So the transitioning decriminalized it also. The cost of marijuana by the pound, even in the black market, reduced dramatically from going down to anywhere from $4,000 a pound, then down to $3,000 a pound, then down to $2,000. And then it got to where you could pick up pounds for $1,000 a pound if you bought like 20 or 30 or 40 in a group. And then it even got cheaper than that, which it is today. I've heard of prices here recently within the last year that pounds of marijuana that are pure bud can be picked up for $500 a pound. And a lot, and the reason being is there's a lot of competition now in making the medical marijuana oils, like the Rick Simpson oil that is used to treat cancer patients, things to this nature. Now that there is a window of opportunity for them to expand on their knowledge and their grow experiences, they have found a legitimate avenue to introduce it into the world. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is the progression, right? Let's go back to the 80s when John Vandekamp and his friends are fighting you guys. And I've been putting up articles just to give people some idea of the reference. It was constantly in the news, especially in the mid 80s when they really thought that they could have a war with you guys. And there was a lot of pushback. I mean, I just put this article up here. I mean, this is an article saying, hey, these are witch hunts, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Harming people. Right. And so there is a balance there. And so how does that work? How do you guys relate to the local populace in a way that allows them to say, hey, we're going to take you to court. We're going to have KCRA or whoever the coverage company is from the media. We're going to fight you on this in the newspapers as well, because that's remarkable to have this industry that's so powerful, so potent. And by the way, one of the things I saw when I was researching this was that not only did the cost of marijuana go up, but the cost of land to grow marijuana.
Oh yeah, it became very popular.
Yeah.
Well, and not only that.
How did you guys? Yeah.
No, go ahead, Pete. Sorry.
I was saying, how did you guys win the public opinion thing? Because there was always a pushback, and it was always like you guys were like pirates almost, to us on the outside. Now I'm not a weed person, but still, you're like those guys are doing something, and the cops can't seem to stop it. And there's articles all over the place. They're saying, hey, you fight us, but you're not going to win.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I couldn't wait to share this in the story. I remember in the Garberville area where I knew a lot of growers and did a lot of work up there in the marijuana business during those years, that everybody was related to everybody. It wasn't just an influx of people moving up that wanted to grow marijuana. There were families up there that had struggling farms and were dealing with the rising cost of keeping their farms in play. So they openly accepted the growing of marijuana because the massive amount of money that was being pulled out of those mountains during those years were, I would like to say, essential to the salvation of the families that had been there for generations that were now getting gobbled up by taxation, by land improvement and land costs and so many things. But even law enforcement people that were on the forces had relatives up there that were growing marijuana, and they were very protective of them. One of the officers, in the sheriff's department up there, when I was pulled out of that van and taken into custody, himself told me that he had relatives up there, and you guys are crazy fools for thinking you're going to come up here into our backyard and rip off patches, because you're going to end up getting shot like your friend just got shot a couple hours ago. So there was a lot of protection from the media, even by law enforcement officers that were localized agents. This is another reason that the feds were brought in at the time that they came in. It was really, yeah, there's a good article on Garberville right there. Everybody was related to everybody in the beginning years before the wave of wannabe growers started moving up there. The hippie communes that were created up in that area were primarily a lot of females that would sit there, and they would be brought up to trim the buds, to water the gardens in the daytime, to do all of the labor. This is before the Mexican cartels decided to get connected up in that time. This was the shifting process time of the marijuana from Mexico shifting to the need for marijuana here without a border crossing. It's just a very, very interesting time. And I lived it. I was smuggling marijuana out of Mexico right up to the point where I lost my guy that moved all of it to the feds and started working out of Northern California through childhood friendships, things of that nature. So I was able to see the impact that it had on a globalized basis, Mexico, America. And I remember people after DEA got so heated up with taking down people up there, and it became like a damn war. I mean, you could hear gunfire at night in some of those towns and communities when raids were going into effect, because these growers, these people, a lot of them, that's their family land. They were protecting their family land, and they were standing behind whatever means necessary to preserve those ranches from being seized because of grow operations, or for simply being taxed off their own family properties that they've held there for generations. Marijuana was a saving grace in those years to so many people, Pete. And it was an argument that I heard countless times sitting there in someone's house as I'm getting ready to grade marijuana to take to Sacramento. And the family would be sitting there, and I'm talking old people at the table going, what choice do we have? What the hell choice do we have? Just kind of like what happened in Mexico during World War II when the State Department went down there and recruited farmers to grow opium poppies so they could have morphine for the European and Southern Pacific campaigns during the World War II. The same thing applies. People will do what is necessary to save and salvage their inheritances, if you will, their generational passing on of that which their forefathers of the family had created and built for them. So yeah, go ahead.
I just put this article up here, and it talks about the towns, right? And I put before that about the reputation of Garberville. And nobody knows about Garberville, but you don't want it to be like, oh, that's where all the people get shot from doing, drug and weed things. And in this article, it talks about police, and when they're local, they're like, hey, what am I going to do? Go up and arrest my neighbor for doing something that brings money back into the community? By the way, putting myself at jeopardy. I'm not doing that.
My point exactly. Pete. I knew families that had sheriffs and marshals and constables that were relatives that would absolutely not let nobody take their family down. They would do whatever was necessary to help sustain the economic growth of a community that was now out of hand with pirate growers like associates I had up there during those years.
In that article, the closing line is, being a peace officer puts me in a bind. So generally speaking, I don't see it. And so he doesn't see the weed, right? Because it's not a problem that he's going to take on.
What they saw and what they were more worried about was the violence that escalated as a result of federal, because the feds came in there, and I mean, it was like a war was starting, and the local community sheriffs and constables, they had it under control before that element of let's take out the Emerald Triangle by the Department of Justice came into play. So there was probably a lot of officers that were extremely protective and very upset about the violence escalation in their communities, because that put their own family members at harm's way. And bear in mind, Pete, some of those were struggling, like Garberville, very small community, the Lake of Laytonville, Covelo, all those little towns. The marijuana industry at that moment before it became violent was a non-violent source of revenue that generated capital that benefited everybody in the communities. Everybody made off of it. And now today we see that it's all legal. It's all legal. It just shocks me so much. And now they can go down, they can get permits from the government, they can grow hundreds of plants, and boy, oh boy, what a transition. Why the hell wasn't that done in the 70s and early 80s when there was a war erupting up there?
There
I'll never
was
understand.
also in 85, because the law enforcement side is trying to do their job, right? And
Sure.
we have a system, and the executive, the mayor, the governor, whoever it is like, go deal with that. And so among the things was, maybe you won't know this, but I imagine you do. They wanted to spray
Paraquat.
paraquat, yeah,
Yep.
on
Remember
these,
it
and I'll
well.
put an article up here. And this is, and then all the Californians are like, that's poison. Do not spray that
Yeah.
on us. And that became a fight. Like, so
Uh,
there's all these fights in the media, in the courts stopping the state, the state coming after guys like you. What did you guys think about all of this? I mean, how does it impact your day-to-day life when you're in this industry?
Well, I can take it back even further. I can take the paraquat spraying all the way to Mexico when I was bringing marijuana from the state of Guerrero, Michoacan, Oaxaca. The government of the United States was down there spraying these mountainsides, and they found just a few years later. Oh, and we used to call it paraquat pot because it would come up with all these spots in the kilos we were purchasing at that time. All of it was poisoned. And what happened was, just within a short period of time, there were farmers and villagers that were ending up with cancer as a result of the paraquat sprays. So the Mexican government shut it down. We didn't allow that to develop into something major up here because of the information that was being generated from what it did to the people in Mexico. My God, the thought of them spraying poison in those beautiful hills of Humboldt County and Trinity County and Mendicino County it makes me sick to my stomach. That is not how you fight a war. What you do is you find a resolution instead, which is what
Right.
they have done in recent years, where they have now legalized it. They have decriminalized it to a point where, I mean, almost all of the serious crime organizations that were involved in marketing marijuana are going to other things such as fentanyl, things like that. The marijuana trade has now become pretty much non-existent in the eyes of organized crime syndicates. It's still very popular, however, with these pockets of small independents that grow and market through their own resources and friends. The market
Yeah.
is it's all changed. But boy, getting back to paraquat, I see you pop that on the screen there. It's
Yeah.
it's I was able to visually see the effect that it had on villages in Mexico during my smuggling years when they put that little play down there, and it was just so wrong. It doesn't just kill marijuana, folks. Paraquat kills everything. I mean,
Yeah.
it was really a nasty poison. So yeah, good. I'm glad you brought that into this interview today. Thank you.
John Norris, the fish and game warden, was talking about when they go and they take down a site. Again, marijuana is legal here, but that doesn't mean there's not illegal grows. And when they do,
Sure.
they're so worried about what chemicals have been sprayed on the marijuana that they go in with Tyvek suits because they
Mhm.
don't want to be exposed to all of this. And what their position is like, hey, we're harming the bears, the raccoons, all of this wildlife because that farm tends to kill everything else off because of the way it's raised. And that has started to change now because there's not as being on a pirate farm is not as profitable as it used to be because now you have the guy down the road who's inspected by the state and there's a lot more control on it. Is that when you guys were in the thick of it in the Emerald Triangle, were you spraying anything on the crop to protect it from insects and whatnot?
No, exactly the opposite. You know what they did? A lot of the people that had the larger grows anyway were growing other types of plants out there that were deterrents to the insects and even to deer that would eat plants. They were growing organic plants by nature. They weren't using anything like that. You got to realize a lot of those people had the hippie complex, that the way
Yeah.
of thinking about preserving the earth and protecting the earth. Like my brother Greg, my friend Greg. He was very protective about that, and he used to plant various types of plant life that would make insects and things that would destroy the plants stay away from them. So he would even blend into the soils when he was making his pockets before he would take a plant from the inside and put it outside to grow. And there was stuff that he'd put, and all of it organic, all of it safe to the environment, safe to the wildlife, but hell on bugs. I mean, it's really pretty
Yeah.
amazing. So that was the people even to this day that are growing. So I really have a conflict about that statement in so many ways because I've known several growers and I've never known any of them to poison the land, poison the plants, spray.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more to that story than we.
There is a lot more. Yeah. And these are criminal enterprises that are working in a different way than you guys were. And they're doing things to
It's a
protect
different
the
time.
crop for shipping and everything else. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, and Greg has spoken to us about this, about how do you market this to a community? I mean, you can't just walk in with a truckload full of weed and be like, I got weed, or maybe you can, I don't know. But he talked about opening up a market and all of a sudden taking over a market that already had people selling marijuana. Is that through the quality of the product? How do you get the word out? How does that day-to-day work for Greg, for you? How does that work when you understand, like, I can take and sell as much weed as you can create, but how do you do that?
That's a great question. I'm sure our audience is going to love this answer. Ladies and gentlemen, I left the criminal world almost 30 years ago. But once you've had the experience of being a criminal, it doesn't leave you. And insofar as marketing loads, even to this day, that are illegal loads that are not monitored by anybody at all, you go to the people that are similar to you that have other resources to even further expand and market the marijuana that's not reported. So that's a really good question, Pete. Yeah, we don't stand on the street corner. We just go to our homeboys or homegirls and, those of us that still carry the outlaw way of thinking in our hearts and our souls. Once an outlaw, you're always an outlaw. Even though I've been a pastor for 30 years, I can't help but think that a lot of my ministry has expounded as a result of the early years of my life. Look at me, the work I do, Pete, in the trap houses. Look what I do in the homeless camps. Do you think that I would be so readily accepted by that environment? I could walk in the house and watch 3 kids at a kitchen table sharing a needle, or some underage girl walking back in a bedroom to trade her body for a $20 hit, and to be able to see this kind of stuff and to be there to be able to comfort them and pray with them and have a chance for open communication. It's because I used to be an outlaw. And that part of us never leaves. When I was a 17-year contractor for the Department of Justice, why was I so good at infiltrating organizations? Because I used to be an outlaw. But we transitioned, as did the marijuana industry, with time. Why didn't they legalize it back there in the 70s and 80s instead of have open gunfights on the streets and in the hills? And oh my God, I was around all that. It was a damn war. And here they are today, the exact same regions, the exact same towns, except now you can go in marijuana store and buy marijuana. You can order oil online and cure your cancer or treat your cancer. It's just, it's just the ignorance of understanding and growing, which is even those of us that are former outlaws, we have transitioned. Look what the work Greg Shipp does today. He cures cancer. He could not have his vast knowledge that is now beneficial to humanity had he had not been transitioned from the outlaw that he was. And I'm going to tell you, folks, this guy Greg that I keep bringing up to you, I've known over 50 years, and he was a founding father, and he was an outlaw. Boy, I mean, he was a dump truck type of guy. Yeah, there you are. Hi, Greg. How you doing? He was going to be doing this interview, but Greg is almost 80 years old now and slowing down in life. And we were able to get quite a bit of information from him, huh, Pete? He helped. He helped make this interview today a reality to us. So hats off to you, brother. Glad you're still above ground with us, and definitely going to dedicate this show to you, Greg.
Dedicated to me. I'll put a note for that on here. All right. I want to wrap this up because there's more to talk about. I'd love to get you and John Norris talking so he can talk about the fishing game and the protection side. And one of the things that's crazy is the guys you're competing with, and I'm kind of taking eras and compressing them, but they now do cross training with SEALs, with with Air Force Pararescue. They go to sniper schools because that's the grade of conflict that was there in the 80s, and they realized they had to up their game. So we have fishing game guys going to the same schools as Navy SEALs to be able to compete with you all. Yeah, and it's wild to think about. And here's the other thing. You guys wouldn't exist if there wasn't a demand for the product, but people wanted the product. And I don't imagine you guys ever hit the top of the product or like, there's too much weed out there now. I mean, there was always a demand for more. And a guy like Greg, who's like, I'm going to make a better and better and better and better, and compare a better and better and better strain of weed, makes more demand.
Yeah, he was one of the creators of a lot of the very famous diesel grain they call them like different forms of diesel, or they call it this or that or the other. And Greg was one of the founding fathers of the cross generations that created. I've seen indica plants that were over 20 feet tall. They were absolutely amazing. But I want to touch on something else right now, Pete, while we're on the topic of the law enforcement play. Ladies and gentlemen, shortly after the beginning of the decline of the mega era of the Emerald Triangle, the Mexican drug cartels started shipping cartel members up here to institute grow operations. Law enforcement was winding down by then. They had eradicated and hit so much that it was starting to become where the funding was being shifted for other resources in the war on drugs. This was the entrance gate that brought in the criminal elements out of Mexico, the actual cartels. Hell, why cross a border when you can grow it? And we've seen the law enforcement start to ease down. And that, Pete, became very dangerous too, because a lot of the Mexican cartel growers that came up here, not all of them, but a lot of them were like former military, definitely cartel connected hitters, people like that. So they added a new element of danger and violence to the play involving the marijuana growing that was going on. At this time, it had already filtered into southern Oregon. It wasn't just in the triangle anymore. So there were regions that were being taken over by the cartels, and they were ruthless. I mean, very ruthless. I remember friends who lost friends in the cartel wars at the end of the era of the Emerald Triangle's infamous growing and exposure and expansion that we as Americans recognize and know. So many people do not understand the transitioning of the drug cartels coming out of Mexico and going up there and implementing their way and their culture into the business. And it was a very dangerous culture. And I imagine it's still going on to this day, but all of us are legal now. We've been legit for years. We're not involved in any of that outlaw stuff anymore. But, we certainly carry the history and the memory of it, which was so important to me for you and I to share this today on this show. And I love, Pete, how you keep bringing up the transitioning of the law enforcement, how they were taking fish and game and taking them to sniper school, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
Well, part of that was because of the cartel's emergence into those regions. You're talking about trained killers coming up here that are directly involved with the cultivation of marijuana now. These aren't hippies anymore. That's all gone. Hugs and handshakes is what we call it. An era is like when I went from smuggling marijuana to cocaine, it went from hugs and handshakes to everybody with AK-47s and your friends were disappearing. It was just unbelievable. That is the element that has since been recreated as a result of the formation of the Emerald Triangle from the 70s. It's like...
go ahead. Is there anything else you want to say? I'm going to wrap this up and put the picture of Greg.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's like Vietnam revisited. That's what it is when you see these professionally trained and facilitated groups that come in with the type of armament necessary to hold off whatever element that may come at them, and they're not afraid to shoot a cop. I can promise you that. So kudos to hearing that part about them training the wildlife, fish and game people and stuff like that. I'm glad to hear that. They need to preserve life.
I think there's 12 of them for all of California, by the way. If you can believe that, you know how big California is. So even then, the funding is limited, right? And
of course,
trying not to start a bigger fight. All right, let me put the picture of Greg up. Tell us your thoughts on Greg, and then I'm going to roll the credits.
Yeah, Greg and I have a history, ladies and gentlemen, of over 50 years. We go all the way back to when I had come out of the VA hospital. I was 19 years of age. As a child, I had lived in Ukiah and went up there, and a friend and I were boar hunting on a ranch up there that Greg was living on at the time. And that's how I met Greg. It was 1974. So 50 years this year that I've known him. And at that time, Greg was probably the leading marijuana grower of northern Mendicino County. Hadn't even filtered into Humboldt yet, or Trinity. But the DEA had him on site, and they dubbed him Operation Mountaintops. That was the title of his operation against him. And ultimately, it caused him to vanish off that whole area altogether. He moved to Montana and started growing marijuana, got involved with the tribes over there, the Indian tribes, and got them all caught up and growing. And oh my God, once a pot grower, always a pot grower when there's somebody like Greg. So anyway, as we said earlier in the interview, Greg hit a point in time in his life where he didn't want to be an outlaw anymore. I ran into him in 1997 on a prison yard in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, where I had just been transferred to. And we hadn't seen each other probably 15 years or so. And I heard somebody holler my name out, and I recognized the tone of his voice instantly. Turned around, and there's Greg Shipp doing federal time. He's been in prison 5 times for marijuana growing, and now he grows massive amounts legally, and it just blows my mind. But he is a humanitarian today. I'm glad you brought him up. He deserves recognition for the amazing work that he does. So yeah, great place to end that.
Okay, folks. Well, that wraps up another episode today, and I'd like to take this moment to thank each and every one of you for taking your time to catch our show. Now, if you like these shows, I would ask that you would please hit like, share, and subscribe. It's so important to us that we get these messages out, and we understand that these are graphic, almost toxic interviews. But, this is the kind of impact that we feel is needed in order to make sure that people understand the significance of the problems that we are confronted within our own country and around the globe. So I'm going to say at this time that I love you all. God bless you all. Hasta luego, y vaya con Dios, and go Victors.